resume recording. Good afternoon, everybody. I am just getting in here. There we go. So we'll take just a moment for everybody to get into the room. So we'll have a pause as those numbers go up. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the next session here at NCHV 2021. My name is Cindy Borden. I'll be your facilitator today, but you will not be hearing a whole lot from me because we have three great speakers for us in our session today. Today's session is infusing an equity focus into organizational operations. And I'm thrilled to have our three speakers. I will just give a basic introduction to them because we want to have as much time as possible to hear from them, but please go into the app and you can find their full bios there. First, we'll be hearing from Erica Hartman, and Erica is the Chief Program Officer at the Downtown Women's Center. So welcome, Erica, we're thrilled to have you. Next, we're going to hear from Jean-Michel Giraud, and Jean-Michel is the President and CEO of Friendship Place here in Washington, D.C. And then last, we have Jayesh Patel, and he is the managing attorney. Is that right? Managing attorney and president. I think I've got that right, Jayesh, of Street Democracy in Michigan. So we've got three very different parts of the country, three different experiences in this work, but we're excited to have you all. And so with that, I am going to hand things over to Erica to get us started.
Thank you so much, Cindy. So I appreciate the opportunity. It's such a pleasure to be here today. As Cindy mentioned, my name is Erica Hartman, and I'm the Chief Program Officer of the Downtown Women's Center. And we can go to the next slide. So a little bit about the Downtown Women's Center. We are located in the heart of Skid Row in Los Angeles, California. Downtown Women's Center was started over 40 years ago and provides an array of wraparound services, including basic needs resources, housing, mental health, medical services. We also provide employment services, and we have our own transitional employment social enterprise for the women. We also have special programs for veterans. We serve primarily unaccompanied women, but we also do serve some women with children in the community. And so in terms of talking about the organizational equity focus and the way it is approached at DWC, I started thinking through sort of the steps that we took in our process, and wanted to start with talking a little bit about how we started looking at this racial equity focus through the lens of trauma-informed care principles. So you can go on to the next slide. So about 6 years ago, we started really looking at our organization to assess the degree to which we were embedding the 6 core principles of trauma-informed care. And for folks who are new to trauma-informed care, in a nutshell, it's looking at the individual not just as they are presenting, but also how past trauma may be impacting that presentation, and how by not re-triggering or re-traumatizing and offering support around trauma, folks are able to be most effective. And so in general, people tend to think of trauma-informed care as an approach to providing direct services, but we recognize that it was a parallel process that we needed to embed throughout the organization in order for our service providers to be the most effective in their work. And so we really took a hard look at every aspect of the organization, from board to operations to HR, to see where we could operationalize these principles and what they meant for our team and our organization as a whole. And I included some resources at the end, but I have a little picture here of our trauma and resiliency informed toolkit that folks can access on our website, and it provides more specifics about how we operationalize these principles. But one of the key principles that I want to call your attention to is number 6, which is cultural and historical and gender issues. And so, as with the practice of looking at trauma-informed care, we conducted an organizational assessment. Again, looking at, what are, the baseline of demographics. And we started to capture this in what we call an equity dashboard. And we went through every single department and looked at, what were the key indicators of where we were meeting our racial equity goals. And one of the things that we've been striving for is to have our staff mirror the community that we serve, and staff being at all levels. So trying to have our leadership level staff mirror our direct service staff, who mirror more specifically the women that we serve. Skid Row is sort of its own unique community within the homeless community, and has greater disproportionality than we see throughout Los Angeles. So it was really an important aspect for us to have the women accessing our services and the team see folks that reflected, their own backgrounds as well. So as a next step, so we've been gathering this data for about a year now, and we had developed what we called a trauma-informed care task force that was really taking a deep dive into each of these principles and how they show up within the organization. So from that trauma-informed care task force, we developed an ad hoc social justice committee. And the ad hoc committee was really focused on figuring out what was the understanding that staff had about just cultural, historical, gender issues, and then how do we translate that to creating an affirming environment, not just for the women, but also for folks coming to work. And so again, I think that this sort of infographic here that highlights the different phases of trauma-informed care are also the components that we had tried to operationalize in terms of embedding these in our work. And so, naturally ensuring that there's a safe environment, that people feel safe coming to work, they feel affirmed, building trustworthiness and transparency. So this is sort of making sure that people are able to have honest and hard conversations, that people can understand that somebody's intent might not necessarily be the impact of what's coming across. And so again, like thinking about these things through this parallel process of how do we empower folks to feel like they can communicate when they feel maybe that they're being treated as a token, for example, or when they feel like somebody may have put them in a little bit more of a confined box than perhaps their identity. And so building that environment where these conversations could happen. And so we held lots of different types of training, from implicit bias to talking about systemic racism, and then just created these opportunities in this like safe space for people to talk, and sort of share their feedback and share their feelings. And especially during this last year of this racial uprising, racial reckoning, there was a lot of sharing of feelings just about what it meant to on the one hand see this outpouring of support from the community, and on the other hand to see just how devastating that the impacts of racism have been. And it's one of those things where the communities experiencing it are fully aware of how this is impacting them, but it's to some extent a function of things like video that have helped communities that maybe haven't directly experienced that understand what people impacted by racism are going through. And so again, so this gave people a real clear opportunity, structured opportunity to be vulnerable, to listen. And I think that that's part of what really built trust is just setting the tone. And a lot of that does come from the leadership team in terms of like creating those intentional spaces and investing resources to bring in speakers. But I think that that really helped our team understand that these are the values of the organization. We also created opportunities for peer support. So we had a facilitator come teach our leadership teams how to hold sessions, where our team could have conversations, ask questions, and understand that, that sometimes it's just a matter of not knowing something. It's not a negative intention that a person might have. And so this network of peer support to process these feelings, to learn and grow together, I think was very empowering for folks and helped people feel like they were able to, better support one another, either, or feel supported personally, or to be sort of allies in this work. We started something that we call the Social Justice Book Club. And so we have, members of our team from all different departments participating. It's a voluntary group, but basically how we structured it was that different folks would take turns leading discussions about reading that they had identified. So it was sort of this shared learning opportunity that was focused on something that felt a little bit more neutral than personal experiences. Again, this idea of collaboration and mutuality, we, in the Trauma-Informed Care Task Force, incorporate folks, again, from all levels of the organization to, operationalize these values. We started with them in the realm of trauma-informed care, and then translated them to how does this show up in being culturally responsive internally, externally? How do we work together to establish these goals? And creating this empowerment of voice and choice. So giving folks opportunities to give feedback, formally through surveys, and then more personally, either with the leadership team or in group settings. And then we made this education piece an embedded part of our organization, so that folks are having ongoing continuing education, that we are, continuing to learn and deepen our understanding of the impacts of, cultural and historical gender issues. And we've been building this out now into a roadmap that we're calling our social justice roadmap. So where we had started with a value of equity, we felt like we really needed to take more of an active approach and figure out not just, sort of philosophically, who do we want to be, but how do we do that and how do we create that space? And so just as a last point, we felt like it was also really important to make sure that we were communicating these values. And, those values are communicated in lots of different ways, from, our communications materials reflecting, people of color, people from the LGBTQ community. Also, we switched our entire organizational values such that they aligned with the trauma-informed care values. We moved from a non-discrimination statement to an affirming diversity statement that, notes that we're an equal opportunity employer, but really highlights that we see value in different backgrounds and different perspectives. And so just in general throughout, like continuing to message this for folks who are coming in to understand, this is who we are, this is what we're about, having different types of imagery throughout the organization, whether it's, different types of like pride symbols, trans affirming symbols. And then as an adjunct to that, we created a group that we call the Culture and Community Task Force that is made up of folks who are not in formal leadership roles, but are, direct service in sort of more like admin roles, so that they would have an opportunity to have a more impactful voice in setting the culture, as opposed to it entirely relying on the leadership. And so the Culture and Community Task Force is sort of looks for opportunities to celebrate Heritage Month specifically, or, to respond to, circumstances going on across the country, by sharing educational materials over email, holding different types of Heritage Month celebrations that are both sort of educational and an opportunity for people to commune around, these issues, and to talk through, where we can step up, what are the action steps, and, how can we move this all forward together. And next slide, please. And so these are some resources I wanted to share. The Downtown Women's Center website, we have a tab that says Learn More, and we list different tools there. Our trauma-informed toolkit is there that operationalizes how to embed some of these principles throughout your organization. And then a really incredible report of recommendations. The Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority a couple of years ago convened an ad hoc committee on Black people experiencing homelessness. And it talks sort of in the umbrellas or buckets of where systems failings and systemic racism have impacted homelessness and how it continues to sort of, create these pipelines. And until we take a hard look and figure out how to distill and operationalize these in the work that we do, that we'll continue to see, disproportionate numbers of Black folks and LGBT folks, generally people of color, experiencing homelessness. So I could go into more about a housing justice program that we built out around this report, but we have a couple other fantastic speakers, so I'll leave that for another day.
Thank you so much, Erica. Please, folks, submit your questions to the chat box. We are going to do questions at the end. Thank you, Erica. That was, you got a lot into that 15 minutes of time, so I appreciate that. We're going to pass things on next to Jean-Michel.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jean-Michel Giraud, the president and CEO of Friendship Place in Washington, D.C. And Friendship Place is a homeless services organization serving the D.C. metropolitan area. And with a national reach through best practices, we present at conferences like this throughout the year. I'd like to thank Cindy for your support and the National Coalition for this invitation. I appreciate it. Next slide, please. I'm going to just give you an idea of the framework of equity at Friendship Place, what brought us to where we are, to the work that we've been doing now for several years. And then I'm going to zoom in on something that happened to us in a new facility that we opened last year, where we actually experienced racism in the neighborhood, and talk you through what we did to help our residents in that facility, help our staff, and in the end, grow our community, because I think that we gained a lot from all this work that we did. So about a year ago, in June actually of 2020, based on the events in Minnesota, based on other things that were going on in the country, I decided to propose a new vision to the board and staff, where we had been working on racial equity for roughly 2.5 years. I proposed an anti-racism approach, and the difference for us in that is that with anti-racism, you take action steps and you move things forward, and you can demonstrate results. And I felt that that change was needed. What we did at the same time is that we also reactivated our LGBTQ+ inclusion work group. So we now have an anti-racism task force that you'll hear about when I talk to you about the facility I mentioned, and an active LGBTQ inclusion work group, producing really good results and disseminating information throughout the organization, inviting dialogue, reaching out to possible allies in the community, in the leadership in the city, in DC, and in the region. The work we've done on equity, of course, was internally and externally facing. Organizations like Friendship Place need to take a look at their own practices to make sure that they align with their values. It's important to have, of course, values, organizational values, align with societal trends. Our society is changing rapidly around this topic of equity, and I think that there's a lot an organization can gain by just looking at what's going on out there, and to make sure that it's catching up if it needs to, or staying up with the trends anyway if it's already doing the work. It's important also, of course, to listen to the most important voices, in this case, the veterans you serve, and to blend their experiences into your message. I think we can all learn from listening to each other's stories, We all bring something to the table, and I think that has to be validated. You heard Erica talk about the environment, and of course, in a rehab-like setting, like a homeless services organization or any other organization working with veterans, our environments are very important, and they need to be conducive, affirming, welcoming, and have all the right pieces in there. They also need to spell out equality among staff and participants, of course. So no more staff bathrooms, for instance, right? If you have those, when you go back to work, you can chisel the sign down and take it down. You need to work with your community at large, your board, of course, your staff, your volunteers. You need to train up so people bring up their level of comfort. We know some of the conversations are difficult for some people. And when you bring up your level of comfort, you're making progress, you're moving forward, you can have dialogue, and you can plan the action steps that you need to accomplish this work. Be creative. I think it's really important. We have been at Friendship Place, and it's been a wonderful experience, actually, for this community. Over to the next slide, please. So I call this anti-racism at the Brooks, and it really reaches beyond the Brooks and beyond this facility that we opened for the city in Upper Northwest, and into the neighborhoods. So through the organization and into the neighborhoods around us. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to set up for you this, what's going on there. The Brooks is a short-term housing facility in Upper Northwest. For those of you familiar with DC, you already know that Upper Northwest is the most affluent quadrant of the city, and it's predominantly white. It has beautiful residential neighborhoods. And the city decided through its homework plan, which is a pun, home and ward, every ward needs to do its share. So Ward 3 in Upper Northwest, just like the other wards, needed to help with this. And the mayor and the Department of Human Services team decided to build a beautiful facility in Upper Northwest, which is essentially what you would call a shelter in your city, probably, but we decided to do away with the word shelter, and we now call these facilities short-term housing facilities. It can serve up to 50 families. It's part of our plan to end family homelessness. And of course, we're going to see in the next slide, please, that when predominantly families of color moved into the neighborhood for a stay of up to 90 days, there were some issues. Most of the people, I will say, were supportive of our families, but we did encounter incidents that were really shocking to us. People made extremely cruel, racist comments. There were microaggressions. Over to the next slide, please. And so on one hand, we have this service-enriched, beautiful facility where people come to rebuild their lives and need to feel safe. And that is staffed also by a majority of staff of color, and then a supportive community around us, wonderful neighbors who help us, and a handful of people who make racist comments, use racist epithets, and I'm going to tell you how we responded to this. Over to the next slide, please. So the project from the beginning, of course, drew some NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard syndrome. Those of you who work in homeless services know that phrase. There were some neighbors who were opposed to the opening of the shelter from the beginning, but most neighbors, again, were supportive. We tried to win over, during the time the building was being constructed, to win over the neighbors, of course, around us by sending positive messaging, and most of the neighbors, again, turned around. But what we experienced, because we opened in April last year, in May and June, these are the better months of the year, more people are out, and some of our families were using a small city park in the back of the facility, open to the public, and that's where they were exposed to racial epithets for 3 of them, microaggressions for several of them, the staff included. There were other forms of scrutiny. There were police reports that seemed to be completely over the top, I will say, about the cars in the neighborhood, about the amount of trash that our residents were supposedly creating in the neighborhood. So you had what essentially was a toxic environment now developing around the program. And we, as we said earlier, our environment has to be conducive, and we had to do something about it. Next slide, please. So we built an effective response. We developed our anti-racism work group. It has a core group also, and I'm a part of that core group with some other leaders from the board and the staff. We decided to change our actions, our planning and everything we did, and to move more toward anti-racism, meaning that we plan actions now. And if you're not doing that yet, if you're still working on equity another way, I would highly recommend moving to that with your community. I think it's highly energizing, and you're able to really mobilize your community members around this goal to become an anti-racist organization. Over to the next slide, please. So the Anti-Racism Task Force meets monthly. There is this core group I talked about. It had internal and external goals. Internally, getting people ready for these difficult conversations we mentioned earlier, getting people to a point where they can actually point out racist comments or attitudes. And there's an interesting thing we discovered as we went along and worked with the folks at the American University Anti-Racist Center, is that they don't actually call people racist, they call out racist comments and attitudes. The advantage of that approach that we've adopted from them is that you don't put people in corners. It's a lot harder for somebody to come back from a comment where they've been called a racist. It's a lot easier for you to help them examine that what they are saying is racist, or that an attitude they have about something is racist. And, you know, with this, to accomplish this goal, you can use at home or with friends, TV, for instance. TV, I think, is a great tool. Old footage from the 60s and 70s, which is often on TV, can be used. Who is on the screen and who is not? And what roles do people on the screen have? And what roles do people of color on the screens have, for instance? So you can work on tools like that and make comments at non-threatening times while people are watching TV or people are talking about a program, and accomplish a lot using an approach that's, again, I think, non-threatening. We provide training to community stakeholders. For us, it's everybody: neighbors, volunteers, staff, participants. We work on having an impact on government decisions. And we've blended anti-racism into the culture of the organization. So again, what's going on out there in the country as of last year, going back to that time, and you blend it into what you do in your organization. Finding allies, of course, and developing action steps. We have, for instance, next slide, please. We have developed a training series that I'll talk to you about. But first, let's look at how we mobilize the community. Friendship Place is a lay organization. We're not a faith-based organization, but we do have 28 religious congregations and friends and neighbors of the group, the Brooks, just a lay group helping us in the community. We mobilized all these folks so that they could help us. In congregations, you have layers, you have the clergy, of course, but you also have mission groups, you have individual congregants and the people they know, their neighbors, their friends, their co-workers. And you can use that approach to really reach out into neighborhoods to fight racism when you encounter it. The volunteers from the congregations and the other group put signs around the park where the families had been exposed to racial epithets. We received support and built the support for participants and staff to respond to microaggressions so that they wouldn't feel uncomfortable when they came. We affirmed our anti-racist stand, of course. We wrote blogs that they're still on our, one of them is still on our website. If you'd like to check it out, it's friendshipplace.org. We organized webinars. COVID for us has been a time when we've organized regular webinars every 3 weeks. And some of these webinars have been focused on systemic racism. We brought food trucks into the neighborhood so that people could have an opportunity to socialize around food and get to know one another. A very simple idea, but it worked. Over to the next slide, please. I've already talked about messaging through the congregational structure, and you can't say enough about the power that these faith-based groups can have when it comes to equity. Most of these groups have mission groups that are focusing on that precisely, we're finding. And most of these groups are looking at, for instance, who attends at the church or the synagogue and how they can diversify. At least it's our experience in DC. The task force developed a 5-part training series, and I'm happy to say that we've given this training series twice already. It was well attended and again open to everybody who wishes to attend. We've invited speakers, for instance. We sought support from city leaders, including our own director of the Department of Human Services, Laura Zeilinger, who gave me some advice on what we could do. Also, our council member in Ward 3, Mary Che, was very supportive. We reach out to nearby schools through parents, including Laura, actually. So you use absolutely every contact you have to spread the word with the idea that the positive voices are going to lower, of course, the negative ones, and that you're going to accomplish what you need to do. We channel information through the community advisory group. Every neighborhood in DC has a smaller group within the ward as part of city government. So we use that, and we consulted with the American University Anti-Racism Center. They were the first center in the country to focus on anti-racism in a university. Now I understand that there's one in Boston, but you can find these resources if you need them. And often they're quite generous with what they share in terms of, the literature that's available on this. And occasionally they may agree to speak at a webinar for you. Over to the next slide, please. So the impact has actually been really positive. We went from a very toxic situation, which was completely shocking and unacceptable, to have families come, from across the city into a neighborhood where people would actually allow themselves to make comments like that or question their presence in the neighborhood. The impact has been positive. Staff feel supported, which is key. They do have to come to work every day and bring, a very positive, supportive attitude. And we had to help them, of course, as people. Some issues remain, some scrutiny remains, but no racist comments so far. And I'm encouraged by the fact that this is June and the end of June. The better weather has been with us now in DC for 3-4 months, and nobody has reported comments yet. So I think that's great. The training series was well received. The level of comfort has increased in the community. We can have these conversations. And again, the leadership in the core group in this, I think, has been key. The 4 of us leading it, making sure that we open the doors and that we continue to grow our work. For instance, we're going to try to reach out to the Asian American community more because of recent events reported in the news, and the Native American community. So continue to expand your work, and we have. Community members increase their knowledge, certainly. We have connections, better connections with government and leaders and groups. Renewed ties with AU. We had not been in touch with them for a couple of years. Okay, sorry, you changed. Thank you, Cindy. the community is effectively mobilized. And I think that's one of the best things that happened to us. The fact that when these pretty enlightened people who live in this affluent neighborhood realized that some of their neighbors could make racist comments and could be so aggressive in their behavior, it really changed their mindset in terms of they are becoming convinced that they had to do something about this and show that this is not what the neighborhood is about. It does not reflect neighborhood values, and everyone needs to be involved in changing things. Positive voices have lowered the negative ones, which is great. And the neighborhood is aware of the need to stop racist acts. Over to the next slide, please.
Jean-Michel, you have
yes.
about 30 seconds because we want to make
Thank
sure
you.
we get it.
Absolutely. I've touched on the rest, so please take my information from the PowerPoint, and I'll be happy to answer your questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Jean-Michel. We will have time for some questions, I'm sure. So I'm going to pass things on over to Jayesh.
Hello, everyone. Jayesh Patel here at Street Democracy. And we are lawyers for homeless people. We are defense counsel at a specialty court in Detroit for homeless people, as well as an SSVF subgrantee. So we handle folks who come into that shelter directly. Next slide. So the way we want to incorporate this is, and kind of how we got started in this work, is to think about these problems that relate to how folks get service. So breakage in the business sense is when you have like gift cards and you don't use them and they're just sitting in a box. Slippage is this idea that like you start a process, but then you fall off. And this is kind of used for this when you're doing mail-in rebates. And so like, what's the percentage of people that's not going to use this service? And also used in like call centers where they put you to decision trees and phone trees so that eventually there's just less volume to actually deal with regular persons. And then lastly is this referral carousel, which was like one of the real big prompts that got me into this, was being inside of a couple of legal aids where I knew the person wasn't going to get services from us. We didn't handle that particular issue, but I took the intake time, filled out the intake, did the demographics, whatever, only to refer them to another place, even though I knew in advance that that was just not going to go. And what that all equals is what's called a high abandonment rate, so that the person sought services, but then ended up stopping. And I thought this was the biggest problem that was kind of like plaguing how clients accessed services. And so I wanted to create a more equitable way for clients to actually get to the services that they need. Some research that's linked in here is the front of the line service. So this is this idea that like co-location of services leads to the same outcomes as in-housing those resources. So I don't have to have my own social worker. I don't have to have my own housing placement person. I just need to be co-located, and I need to do it in a way that, and this is a second study on hospitals in Singapore, but if I can make this service comprehensive, accessible, responsive, I got responsive twice in there, individualized, transdisciplinary, accountable, and seamless, then I will achieve this front of the line service without necessarily having to co-opt power from either my partners or compromising like the ability of the client to get through the whole entire process, and lowering my abandonment rate. So when we first started, we were out in soup kitchens without a direct, just directly taking intake. And our abandonment rate was around 90+%. And so as we started to get direct partners, we closed that off. We thought like, this isn't working because we don't have social workers. How could we do it so that we would just, so we closed intake and we have just direct access to us as attorneys. So I have 6 organizations that directly feed me clients. They got my cell phone. And same with the my partner who has the direct line from the SSVF shelter provider. When they call the attorney, their number is directly to them. This requires us to hire people with T-shaped skill sets. And so that means like a broad base of skill sets with expertise in one singular place, one or two singular places. And that way we're able to answer most of the questions for the people who get to us, not having to pass them off to people within our organization. And if we do need help, we have this other folks internally and in our legal community to get that information from. But that doesn't compromise the relationship between us and the client. This community-centric fundraising. So this is a part where I think this is where kind of like thinking through how we can better serve our clients comes in, is that most of our funding we try to get through our partners. And if we can get the things through our partners, that does two things. One, it allows us to kind of mingle funds on our end so that we can provide comprehensive services to the client without it necessarily affecting their reporting requirements. I'll give you an example of this is that our project, my project, which is the criminal justice side at the court, we get funding separately for that. And the SSVF money comes in, and that covers civil legal aid. But because we have this back office and these ideas that we can mix and match our money for the client, it doesn't matter. They call us, they're going to get both. And for the referral that comes in, they don't have to worry either. They don't have to decide whether this person has a question or not. They just send every single client to us. We do the legal checkup. We kind of screen for that so that it takes one burden off of our partner as well as another burden off of our clients. And again, kind of creating equity within the process. Another thing is we have an open database so that we can make that conversation between us, our partners, and our clients all seamless and work together. And the last thing is service-centric metrics versus donor-centric metrics. And so this is one of those things where we used to have these at least one of my legal aids, we'd have to have a 15-minute phone call. That was our target. We wanted to serve X number of people, and we wanted to get those calls within 15 minutes. And that's great and fine, but that's like a donor-centric metric, is that we want to hit these numbers for our donors' purposes. It doesn't necessarily advance our clients' interests. So instead, we want to touch as many, we want to do full service as much as possible. And that's our main metric, so that the person leaves us and they do not have legal issues afterwards. And if that takes more time, then that's what we're going to do. And I'll explain this to the donor or our partner that we had to do this for this purpose. But that was our way of centering clients in our centering equity and power and balancing power between them and us. And so I would say that our abandonment rate now is somewhere around, once we were able to make initial contact with them, is around 15 to 25%. So it's a huge drop, which then means our time is more effective or more utilized for actually achieving results for our clients. So that I think is there. I'm going to move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so hiring. Again, this is one of those problems that we had experienced in how do we attract less advantaged talent or talent with lived experience. And, originally we thought that, we'll just post it on the Monster and the big boys and then call it. And what we realized is that's no good. It doesn't get you anywhere. So a few things here is all studies that are related somewhere or toolkits, but essentially limiting qualifications because of stereotype tax and threat that happens with minorities and women when applying, is the qualifications seem to be thought to be as a bar to entry. And so by lowering the qualifications, we'll attract more talent. Targeted recruitment is essentially going after those pockets of talent specifically towards recruitment. So reaching out to bar associations that are either ethnic bars or the women's bar, things like that, to try to LGBTQ bar to get those folks to apply for us or apply to us, as well as talking to colleagues. So hey, we're looking for folks. Do you have anybody in mind? And knowing that, that might be a better way to get that. The last thing is we are in criminal justice reform is one of our big components. So we do inverted background checks. So again, we ask, hey, have you had an experience with poverty or having a record. And so like everyone at our practice right now has a record. And it informs us because we're allowed to be able to then say like, yeah, I've been where you've been. And it allows us to have this like just genuine conversation, be like, and so we front that. We obviously disclose, of course, that we all got one. And so then it makes that conversation just like so much easier. But it is important to ask and know that we want it rather than we're not wanting it. And centering that. Collaborative hiring, we have a lot of partnerships with other social service providers. So part of what we do is we incorporate them into our hiring team. So the employees have a say, our partners have a say, our clients have a say before any person is hired, as well as a pilot project. So we ask them to do a pilot project before we'll bring them on. And this is part of the limited qualifications, is that to make sure that the project is related to, so that people think that I don't have those qualifications, but I could do the work, but they won't apply. And this is our way to still have limited qualifications, but pay people for their time for applying for us, and then still giving them a pilot project that then protects us before we have to go full hire. Next slide, please. So this is Pass the Baton. So this is about creating leadership from within. And how do we want to grow our leadership? So even if we bring people in, we want to make sure that we're like, passing leadership along. And so what we kind of stole here a lot from military. So I hope I got it right when we translated this to our world. So the first is collaborative placement. So even if we can't hire you, we'll either try to like, put you in some position or give you like a small project, and try to get you placed in places that with partners that could work. So our social worker now started off as an internship placement with a partner, and then we brought them in when we were able to hire them. We had another person who we hired as an organizer, a part-time organizer, and because of their position in all those circles, was hired by one of our partners. So that's a really good way to kind of like bring folks in that even though if you don't have all the money right now, it could still give the pathway into the practice. Coach not managed, no big deal. Operational art, levels of war. The only really interesting thing there is that, thank you. Only really interesting thing here is that we do like something called like a fractal design. So everyone has a client, everyone has a project. And because of this, we all are touching rough parts of the practice so that in any one instance, we're all learning all the skills that we need so that one of us could rise eventually to take the leadership position over. Servant leadership, this is essentially where it's each of our jobs to help the other person grow. So at the end of our calls that are our one-on-one calls, each of us asks, is there anything you need from me? So we're not pushing that into the future. We're just kind of like taking that right now, offering that window so that it's so there isn't this lack of communication. But it does help, I think. And decentralized command is just essentially the same thing where everyone is practicing in a way of leadership. I want to move on to the 2 slides, please, forward. Yeah, thank you. So I'm also chair of the Commission on Homelessness and Poverty. And again, same thing, George Floyd, we all had this reckoning. And if you can go one more slide, please. And so we were like, like no matter what the horrible policy that we're looking at, we are still seeing that lawyers were there at every stage, either enshrining it into the law or protecting it once it was enshrined. And perpetuating it. And so we said we had to do something. So if you can click on the blueprint. So what we did is, and I just want to quickly kind of like, and this kind of follows up with Erica's about operationalizing our values. So it may not pop for y'all, but essentially what it was a 5-point plan where we kind of like, first, we had to reckon with why we didn't do things a certain way. Like, why did we, on our own, not talk about race? Even though it's like homelessness and poverty, which is like intrinsically tied to race. So we had to ask why we didn't do it. First, we decided we had to act. The second thing we was like, why didn't we do this? and have that deep conversation. We brought in a bunch of old leaders and asked the longtime members to like share your reasons why you didn't do it. We talked about kind of the ways that it was still present, both in terms of like interpersonal practice as well as like external, and the policies and procedures we kind of like let slide or championed and maybe needed to reconsider. And we can go into those a little later. But then we want to develop our own values. And then we wanted to tie action or two to it. And if you want to scroll, this is the point 4, but adopt our values in 3 and 4. Like we wanted to really kind of figure out like, what does that mean? Like, and how do we operationalize it? And so if you scroll a little to the checklist, you can pick like standards checklist, let's say there. And so in this one is essentially we said, okay, we have a bunch of, we're in the position where we get to either create grants or apply for grants and recommend policies. Like this is a good model for dealing with people who are homeless and have criminal justice entanglement, or how to deal with evictions. And so we said like, well, how are we gonna do this? And so we created this standards checklist so that when we are thinking about policy or bigger proposals, we want to make sure that we do this assessment every time. And so the first one is lived experience. Has voice been in here, and is it incorporated in a meaningful way? Have you thought about any underrepresented communities that may have a unique perspective on this? The next 4, I think, is the most important when it comes to really analyzing power, which is who is the direct beneficiary of the policy and the money that's going to happen from this? Is it us as lawyers? Is it social workers? Is it our clients directly? And would it be better if it was directly towards them? So what is the best solution? So in the case of like criminal justice entanglement, maybe the best solution is just decrim and not even have lawyers, not even have social workers involved in this. And so to think through and like actually decide what is the best, and does this actually get us there? Simplicity, and this is a lot with rate of abandonment, but like, is this process so simple that like it's easy to explain and easy to understand by a person not a lawyer? And so that compliance is easy, that performance is easy. And lastly is human-centric. Is it designed with humans in mind, both from the perspective of our clients being able to exercise their own rights, so they don't need a lawyer, and then the complications of like managing that lawyering, as well as that it's contemplating like what's called fault tolerance. So this idea that like, like when you Google search and you misspell something. So like we're all humans, we're all fallible, sorry. And so that we want to make sure that the system is tolerant of this and designed to accommodate this, rather than like what it currently is, which is, drastic when we fail. And so these kinds of things we've kind of created as a blueprint to hopefully help other folks kind of think through when are some appropriate times to like go through this analysis. But that's all I got. I'm happy to talk about more later. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayesh. I am trying to go back to the slideshow. So flipping between between websites and other things is not my strong suit in Zoom. So I apologize for that. But I actually got it right back to where we needed to be. So we have a few minutes for questions. I want to thank all 3 of you for sharing. There's so much good information here, and we condensed you and squished you into just a few minutes each. So we appreciate you being patient with our time constraints. I am going to make sure folks have all of your contact information as well. So I'll put that up. But one question that I have for each of you is, what do you suggest to someone who wants to start this within their own organization, to start this idea of infusing equity, but may not be at a level where they have the power or the agency to do it themselves? So they have to get someone else on board to make it happen. What would you suggest they do as sort of the first step? For example, I'm a frontline caseworker, and I see that this is an issue internally. how do I go about starting to bring up those conversations internally to help make that change?
I can start if you'd like briefly. Bring it up in a meeting, in a staff meeting. It can be brought up in any meeting, I think, and it's really important that people know that. Sometimes people feel that if they bring things up, something is gonna happen. It's really essential to have people feeling free to express themselves in organizations like ours. And we really work on that to have this sort of open culture at Friendship Place.
I think what sort of comes to mind is thinking about like who the audience is and maybe identifying like who with the ability to impact the organization might be the most receptive person to talk to. I think there's a lot of research too that supports how outcomes are more effective when diversity of perspectives is brought in. I'm a big fan of the Harvard Business Review, and there's lots of different articles in there about why this is important, and sometimes pointing to an authority source sort of takes the pressure off an individual who isn't in a formal authority role. So I think that might be one starting place if that's your audience, if your audience needs an authority source.
I would say that I think we all have authority that we don't actually, or agency that we don't actually think we have. So first, I have authority with my client, right? Or directly with the person I'm dealing with. So I can extend power directly to the person I'm serving. That's step one. Two, I have colleagues, right? So like, hey, I tried this with my client that might work for you working with your client. Let's see if it works. Or try it with your next one. Tell me how it goes. And that might be, so now you have 2, 3, 4 of your friends to go to your boss at the next meeting. There's also wagging the dog. So what we're doing with the ABA, for example, we created our blueprint. It comes with a couple of letters that we sent, like, stapling things to the door. And with that comes some agency that even though we're not like forcefully like saying you must change, we're telling the rest of the ABA that this is what we're going to do. And we're going to show ourselves by being accountable. We're going to tell you how it's going. We're just going to do this every year. We're just going to send it and we'll see what happens. We had this we're in a shared space, and we had the doors and the signage that Erica was talking, Jean-Michel was talking about, right? Friendly LGBTQ signage. Our signage wasn't there. So we just like slapped a sticker on it, right? And then somebody's got to answer that, right? We didn't have feminine hygiene products in there. Slapped it right on the door. Hey, there's no feminine hygiene products up in here. And so I think that we do have agency. And again, I don't necessarily recommend everyone go as crazy as I would go, but I think we do have this power up and down and laterally that we can use and leverage.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm looking at the time. We have about a minute, so I'm going to try and squeeze in another question. And this question is a big question, so it's going to be sort of quick answers, but what do you do with the resistance? If you are working this, and whether that resistance comes from clients, from colleagues, from leadership internally, whether it comes from some of your external partners who see what you're doing and are resisting, whatever that resistance might look like, what advice do you have in sort of dealing with it?
I can say even as somebody in a formal authority role, like even in an executive leadership role, I have encountered that sort of a situation before. And I think that it can be really tough if, you feel like you're a lone voice out there. So one of the things that we did was a survey to aggregate all those voices. So it was an anonymous opportunity for people to give feedback. And I think that felt like a safer space, but it is tough. And, it can be, a scary place to be in, but sometimes if an organization can see all that aggregated, it can be helpful to, demonstrate the importance.
So I would say you just need one, right? So like when you're one person, you're the crazy dude. And then when it's two people, you got a movement. And I think that like to I linked in the law of diffusion of innovation. But essentially, this is this idea that like, you're always going to have laggards and you're always going to have early adopters, and you just need to find the early adopter, and that will start the tidal wave. And I would say that like, just you haven't knocked on enough doors, right? Somebody out there thinks like you in your organization, can help you get there. You just have to keep knocking, and also like just keep talking about it. I think eventually, like the person who talks the most is gonna eventually change. It's like the water in Grand Canyon. There it is.
I would say know that this is the right thing to do. Be intentional, show people the path, keep going till you get there. And when you get resistance, you need to think of why the person is resisting. There could be a number of reasons, but you can win them over, you can turn them around.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for bearing with me. We're a couple minutes over time, but I think that last one was important. So Erica, Jean-Michel, Jayesh, thank you all so much. We really appreciate the conversation and all the great information that was shared. And thanks to everyone else who attended. And my last plug is we do have Tai Chi at 4:15 for anyone who needs relaxing and wellness and self-care. So thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Very much. Take care.